It was one of those nights when the cold seemed to hum against the metal of the highway. January of 2009. The kind of still, sleepless dark that every long-haul driver knows too well. Empty lanes, sodium lights fading into black, the constant rhythm of tires and wind. Earl Ray Danner had been on the road for nearly 16 hours, hauling a refrigerated load of produce bound for Nashville. He'd made this same route for years, knew every fuel stop, every diner that stayed open past midnight, every patch of asphalt where the CB signal always cut out. Ray was 42 years old, steady and seasoned. The kind of driver who still wrote notes in his logbook, even when the company had switched to digital. Married 20 years, 2 grown kids, no drama, no debts. To most who knew him, he was the picture of predictability, a man who didn't take detours. That night, according to the truck's electronic log, Ray had left Oklahoma City around 6 p.m. He radioed dispatch twice, once near Fort Smith to confirm fuel prices, and again at 12:17 a.m. as he crossed into western Arkansas. The dispatcher later said his voice sounded calm, maybe a little tired, but there was nothing unusual. His ETA for the Nashville depot was listed as 7:40 a.m. At 12:47 a.m., his CB went silent. The next morning, when the day dispatcher logged in around 7:30, Ray's truck pinged the same coordinates it had been sending all night. Mile marker 214, off the eastbound side of I-40, a rest area he'd used before. The dispatcher tried calling his phone 3 times. No answer. They radioed neighboring rigs, asked if anyone had seen a dark blue Peterbilt with the Danner Freight logo parked overnight. One trucker replied that he'd noticed a rig matching that description sitting near the tree line with its hazards blinking. He thought maybe the driver had dozed off. By 9:15 a.m., when the company still hadn't heard back, Arkansas State Police were dispatched to perform a welfare check. What they found would mark the beginning of a case that would stretch nearly a decade. The Peterbilt sat alone at the far end of the lot, engine off, front tires angled slightly right, as if it had just rolled to a stop. The hazard lights were still clicking. The trooper approached expecting to find someone asleep inside, but the cab was empty. The driver's door was locked from the outside. Through the glass, he could see a half-finished cup of coffee resting in the holder, steam faintly fogging the windshield, a jacket draped neatly over the passenger seat. The keyring still hung from the ignition. They broke the lock to enter, assuming a medical emergency. But there was no one inside. Ray's wallet sat on the dash with his ID and cash untouched. His cell phone and logbook were on the seat. The bunk was neatly made. There were no signs of struggle, no scuff marks, no spilled coffee, no torn fabric. Nothing. Just a driver who'd vanished somewhere between midnight and dawn. Outside, the temperature had dropped below 30 degrees overnight. The ground was hard, dusted with frost. Investigators found no footprints leading away from the truck, no drag marks, no tire impressions, except Ray's own. The area surrounding the rest stop was mostly pine and low brush, a strip of forest that stretched for miles before giving way to farmland. The troopers swept the lot, questioned 2 other drivers who had parked farther down. One said he arrived around 3 a.m. and noticed the blue Peterbilt already there, lights flashing. He assumed the driver was having electrical issues. The other trucker recalled hearing a short burst of static over the CB just after midnight, followed by what sounded like a click and silence. No voice, no sign-off. When the investigation reached Ray's family, the confusion deepened. His wife, Carla, told police that her husband never left his rig unlocked, never slept outside the cab. He was cautious to a fault, she said. He'd rather pull over in traffic than risk a bad parking lot. She described his routine, how he always called home before his final leg, how he carried a small thermos of coffee and a Bible on the dash. He had no reason to walk away, no stress, no hidden life. Detectives scoured the area for cameras, hoping to trace his final movements, but the rest area's surveillance system had been offline for maintenance that entire week. A technician confirmed the outage in the logs. No footage existed from the night of January 14th. A canine unit was brought in later that afternoon. The dogs picked up a faint scent from the truck's cab and followed it east toward a patch of woods behind the lot. The trail continued for about half a mile, through thin underbrush and along a drainage ditch before suddenly stopping near a culvert that emptied into the highway median. Beyond that point, Nothing. No scent, no personal items, no tracks. It was as if the man had walked straight into the dark and vanished. For days, search crews combed the area. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. Volunteers from nearby towns joined in, and state police expanded the perimeter to 10 miles. They found nothing. No signs of Ray, no clothing, no remains. When news outlets picked up the story, it spread fast across trucking forums. Drivers posted theories, stories, warnings. Some swore that stretch of I-40 had always been strange. Rest stops where lights flickered for no reason, radios picking up phantom chatter on unused frequencies. But investigators stayed grounded. They believed one of two things had happened. Ray suffered a sudden medical event and wandered off in confusion, or he encountered foul play. But both theories broke down quickly. His health record showed no conditions that would cause disorientation. And if it had been foul play, where was the evidence? The wallet, the cash, the truck itself, all untouched. Nothing suggested robbery. By the end of that week, the case shifted from a missing person search to an open investigation. The Danner family pressed authorities to expand beyond the rest area. State police mapped every nearby road, farmhouse, and drainage system. Divers checked retention ponds. They even searched the surrounding woods using ground-penetrating radar. Still, no trace. The emptiness of the scene haunted everyone who visited it. Drivers who stopped there in the weeks afterward said they avoided parking in the same spot, the one where the blue Peterbilt had sat blinking through the night. Some described feeling uneasy, like the place itself was holding its breath. For Carla, each unanswered question built into quiet panic. She called the company daily, begged troopers for updates, drove the entire route herself, trying to imagine what could have gone wrong. When she reached the rest area for the first time, she parked exactly where his truck had been found. She said the silence was deafening, the hum of the highway fading until all she could hear was the wind pushing through the pines. That's when she noticed something, the faint ring of frost still visible on the asphalt, outlining where the truck's tires had rested. That image stayed with her. By February, the case went cold. Dispatch records, phone logs, GPS, pings, none offered new leads. The final known contact with Earl Ray Danner was that radio transmission at 12:17 a.m., his voice steady, calm, saying he'd see them in the morning. And then, nothing. But one detail would keep investigators uneasy for years to come. The truck's computer system, when reviewed later, revealed the ignition had been turned off manually. Someone had shut it down from inside the cab, and the only way to lock that door from the outside was with the driver's own key. It was a small, almost forgettable detail, one line in the report that most readers would skim past. But for those who truly studied it, it changed everything. Someone else had been there that night, and whoever they were, they'd left behind no trace at all. The case of the missing truck driver was just beginning. By the next morning, the quiet mystery of one missing driver had become an active search operation stretching across miles of cold Arkansas back road. State troopers closed off the rest area just after sunrise, marking tire tracks and shoe impressions in the frost. The air hung still, except for the low hum of diesel engines idling in the distance. It had been less than 24 hours since Earl Ray Danner's last radio call, but already time felt heavy. Every minute that passed without a trace of him was one step closer to something irreversible. K-9 units arrived first. The dogs were trained to follow scent through mixed terrain, diesel fumes, brush, and cold air. Handlers started at the Peterbilt, where Ray's jacket still hung neatly over the passenger seat. They passed the fabric under the dogs' noses and watched them leap down from the step rail, noses to the ground, tails stiff with purpose. For nearly half a mile, they followed a trail into the tree line, weaving between pine trunks and over brittle leaves. Searchers marked their path with orange tape as they went. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the scent vanished near a drainage culvert that fed into the highway median. The dogs circled, confused, whining at the cold metal pipe. After that point, nothing. The trail was gone, as if the person they were tracking had simply stepped off the map. Helicopters took over by mid-afternoon, sweeping thermal cameras over the surrounding fields and forest. The imagery came back clean. No heat signatures larger than wildlife. Troopers checked abandoned barns, roadside ditches, even irrigation ponds used by nearby farms. Not a single item belonging to Ray was recovered. No hat, no boots, no torn clothing, nothing. Investigators began to retrace his last known movements, assembling a timeline that felt airtight on paper, yet empty in reality. His final fuel stop, time-stamped 12:22 a.m., confirmed he'd filled 87 gallons at a truck plaza near Van Buren. The attendant remembered him, said he'd been polite, quiet, and even cracked a small smile when she wished him a safe night. His receipt from the diner 30 miles back, tucked neatly into his logbook, showed he'd ordered black coffee and apple pie. He'd tipped generously the way he always did. Cell tower data placed his phone ping near exit 214 at exactly 12:41 a.m., just minutes before the CB went dead. Everything stopped right there, on that patch of highway surrounded by pine and gravel. At first, the working theory was simple. Maybe a robbery gone wrong. Long-haul truckers often carried cash, and isolated rest areas had seen their share of ambushes. But this one didn't fit. Ray's wallet was still inside the cab, untouched. His phone, his keys, his tools, everything of value had been left behind. If someone had meant to rob him, they'd walked away with nothing. The next theory came from the psychological angle. Voluntary disappearance. Investigators had seen it before. Drivers who had had enough, who used the anonymity of the open road to vanish, start over somewhere new. But again, the facts refused to cooperate. Ray had no debt, no secret accounts, no second phone. He'd called his wife every night of every trip for 20 years. His finances were clean, his life uneventful. When his wife Carla heard that theory, she told reporters it was impossible. Ray didn't run from anything, she said. He was the kind of man who fixed what was broken. By the third day, search crews were exhausted. The weather had turned, sleet cutting visibility in half. Local volunteers brought coffee and blankets, but morale was slipping. Then, a flicker of hope. Another driver came forward. His name was Daniel Briggs, a long haul out of Tulsa who'd been westbound through the same corridor that night. He told police that around 1 a.m., he'd seen a man walking the shoulder of the interstate, a quarter-mile east of exit 214. The man wore a reflective vest, the kind issued by most trucking companies. Briggs slowed briefly, assuming it was a driver checking a load or heading toward the rest stop. He didn't stop. There was no reason to. But the sight stuck with him after he saw the missing person alert. Investigators clung to the lead. They sent teams along both sides of the highway, combing ditches and drainage lines. But again, nothing. No footprints, no discarded vest. It was as if the sighting existed only in the space between headlights. Forensic teams processed the Peterbilt more thoroughly in the following days. They dusted for prints, scanned for DNA, swabbed the steering wheel and gear shift. Every print matched Ray's or belonged to known service techs. No foreign DNA, no sign of forced entry. Even the dirt on the floor mat matched soil from the rest area. Whoever might have taken him, or whatever happened, had left no trace inside that cab. The case began to draw attention from regional media. Headlines called it the vanishing driver of I-40. Reporters pointed out eerie coincidences, how several truckers had gone missing along the same corridor in past years, how each disappearance happened within 10 miles of an unmonitored rest area. Truckers online debated whether something more organized was at play. But for police, nothing connected. Each case had different circumstances, different companies, different routes. There was no single pattern, only the uncomfortable fact that a 42-year-old man had vanished in a stretch of highway that swallowed people whole. The investigation spread outward. Detectives interviewed local residents living along nearby county roads. Some said they'd heard dogs barking that night around 1 in the morning. One man claimed he saw headlights turn down an access road that led toward the river, but he couldn't recall what make or model. Another woman reported a noise like metal scraping, though the timing didn't line up. Every tip led nowhere. By the end of that first week, investigators had logged over 200 man-hours. The FBI offered consulting support, analyzing the GPS and digital logs. Nothing new surfaced. The transponder data was clean, the route unbroken, the truck's diagnostics showing no sign of tampering. The only unexplained detail remained the same. The engine had been turned off manually, and the driver's door had been locked from the outside. For Ray's family, those details felt unbearable. Carla stopped sleeping. She drove to the rest area nearly every other day, hoping someone would come forward, that maybe a forgotten camera from a passing rig had captured something, anything. But no video ever surfaced. The truck was eventually towed to the impound lot, its engine cold and silent. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation lost momentum. The dogs were redeployed. Search teams moved on. Newspaper. Stories shifted to newer headlines. Only Carla kept the story alive, calling local stations, printing flyers, visiting truck stops along I-40 with her husband's photo. By spring, Ray's name had joined a list nobody wanted to be on, the unofficial catalog of highway disappearances stretching across the southern states. Drivers who vanished mid-route, some never found, others recovered under circumstances that raised more questions than answers. It was a world of transience and danger, where every rest area held its own quiet dread. And yet, for all the rumors and speculation, the evidence refused to change. No footprints, no body, no vehicle movement after 12:47 a.m., just an idling truck, a cup of coffee cooling in the dark, and a family left waiting. The official record ended with one final note in the case log. Search exhausted, no further leads, case remains open. But for everyone who had stood in that frost-covered lot, staring at the truck that should have been halfway to Tennessee by sunrise, one thought never went away. Someone out there knew what happened. They just hadn't spoken yet. For most families, grief dulls over time. But for the Danners, it never did. Each year that passed without answers seemed to sharpen it instead, turning confusion into obsession, and silence into fuel. In the beginning, Carla Danner tried to hold on to the structure of everyday life. She went back to her job at the local bank, kept her son in school, and made the long drives to Little Rock whenever police called her in for updates. But as months turned into years, the updates stopped coming, and all that was left was waiting. Arkansas State Police kept the file technically open, but activity on it dwindled. Each call Carla made was met with polite sympathy and familiar phrases. No new leads. We'll let you know. We haven't forgotten. But she could tell they had. The missing trucker cases never drew much attention. They were quiet tragedies that faded fast once the headlines dried up. She promised herself that Ray's wouldn't be one of them. She began learning how to navigate bureaucracy on her own. Nights spent at the kitchen table turned into months of combing through FOIA request forms, trying to access highway patrol dash cam logs, way station footage, anything that might capture her husband's truck that night. She called the Department of Transportation, state highway maintenance offices, even private security firms that oversaw rest stops. Most told her the same thing. Footage was either lost, overwritten, or never recorded at all. Still, she filed requests, sent letters, and kept every denial in a neatly labeled binder. Her son, Tyler, watched as his mother built a wall of evidence around their dining room. Maps with colored pins, copies of truck stop receipts, weather reports, and printouts of Ray's last known GPS coordinates. The pattern became familiar. She'd find something small, like a name in an old police note or a timestamp that didn't line up, and she'd follow it for weeks until it hit another dead end. Every time it did, she'd tape that page to the wall anyway, because to her, it still meant something. 2 weeks after Ray vanished, Carla received a call that would haunt her for years. It came late, around 10:30 p.m. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something, maybe instinct, made her answer. All she heard was static. Then, faintly, the sound of breathing. For nearly 30 seconds she stayed frozen, whispering her husband's name into the receiver. And then, the line went dead. She reported it immediately. Investigators traced the call to a prepaid cell phone purchased in Texarkana, about 70 miles from where Ray disappeared. The number was inactive by the time police reached it, and no buyer could be identified. The technician who reviewed the trace said it was likely a spoofed line, but Carla never believed that. The location of that call, the direction her husband had been heading, was too specific to ignore. After that night, Carla began documenting everything. She bought a small spiral notebook and wrote down each call, each message, each theory. When she couldn't sleep, she'd scroll through missing persons forums, reading about other truckers who'd vanished along southern interstates, stories eerily similar to Ray's. That's when she created a Facebook page titled The Long Haul Home. It started as a small memorial, a place for friends and family to post memories, but it quickly drew in others, spouses, children, and co-workers of missing drivers from across the country. They began sharing maps, stories, and patterns that stretch beyond one man's disappearance. Every January, on the anniversary of the night Ray went missing, Carla and Tyler drove the same highway eastbound. They always stopped at exit 214, where the truck had been found. By the third year, the rest area had changed. The vending machines replaced, the pavement resurfaced. But the old utility pole near the edge of the lot was still there. They'd tape a note to it each time. Some years it was a prayer, some years it was a promise. By the seventh year, there were dozens of faded slips of paper layered over one another, fluttering when the trucks roared by. Occasionally, journalists revisited the story. A few documentaries even reached out. They always mentioned the same chilling detail, that Ray's truck had been locked from the outside, a small but damning piece of evidence that hinted someone else had his keys. For most viewers, it was an eerie coincidence. For Carla, it was proof. She spoke in quiet certainty when interviewed, always using the present tense when referring to her husband. She said she didn't believe he'd left willingly, that something had happened that night no one was willing to see. The case never brought her peace, but it gave her purpose. Tyler, now in his 20s, helped maintain the Facebook page, posting updates whenever a new clue surfaced. But behind the public effort, the family was unraveling. Birthdays came and went. Holidays grew quieter. Every unanswered lead became another reason not to let go. In 2016, nearly 7 years after Ray disappeared, something finally shifted. A cold case analyst named Megan Lowe, new to the Arkansas State Police Unit, was reviewing dormant files as part of a digital archiving project. When she opened the Danner file, she noticed something strange buried in the technical logs, a line referencing a GPS ping recorded 3 days after Ray's disappearance. It was brief, just a few seconds of transmission, but it had come from a location 20 miles west of where the truck was found. The coordinates pointed to a rural patch of land near a service road, close to the Texas border. The data had never been flagged because it came after the company had marked the truck as inactive. When Megan brought it up to her supervisor, they dismissed it as a data glitch, but she sent Carla an email anyway, outlining what she'd found. For Carla, it was like being jolted awake. She printed the coordinates and drove there herself. The area was overgrown, marked by dirt access trails used by construction vehicles. Nothing looked out of place. Still, she stood there for hours, staring at the horizon, wondering if her husband's truck had been there, if someone had moved it before the police found it. When she returned home, she added a new pin to the map above her desk, a red one marking the 2016 coordinates. She stared at the growing cluster of pins, Van Buren, Exit 214, Texarkana, and now this. The lines between them formed a crooked corridor stretching straight toward the Texas border. By then, her obsession had become ritual. Every night, before she went to bed, she refreshed the missing trucker forums and searched public databases for VIN numbers matching her husband's rig. She knew it was irrational. The truck had been impounded years ago, but she couldn't stop. She believed there had to be something they'd all missed. The GPS anomaly reignited the case briefly. Detectives revisited old leads, checked the company's transponder logs, and even ran soil samples from the rest area's original perimeter, but nothing new emerged. Still, for Carla, it was validation, proof that her husband's disappearance hadn't been as straightforward as everyone assumed. She told friends she could feel it, that something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would eventually rise. And she was right, because 2 years later, a construction crew clearing land less than 30 miles from those coordinates would make a discovery that would pull everything she'd ever suspected into focus, and finally bring the search to an end. In early March of 2018, nearly 9 years after the night Earl Ray Danner vanished without a trace, a quiet corner of Texas would become the center of a case long thought buried for good. It began as nothing more than a work order. A construction crew had been clearing a section of overgrown land near DeKalb, about 15 miles south of the Arkansas border, to make way for a new access road. The area was dense with cedar and pine, uneven ground that hadn't been touched in decades. As the excavators cut deeper into the brush, one operator noticed his bucket scraping against something solid, metallic, and rusted. At first, he assumed it was an old farming implement, but as the dirt fell away, a familiar shape began to emerge. Edges of a fender, the curve of a windshield, and beneath that, a faded blue paint job barely visible under layers of mud. When they realized they were staring at what appeared to be the remnants of a semi-truck cab, work stopped immediately. Deputies from the Bowie County Sheriff's Office were called to the site, and within hours, crime scene tape ringed the perimeter. The vehicle sat at the bottom of a narrow ravine, wedged beneath years of compacted soil and decayed branches. To the casual eye, it might have looked like a wreck that had rolled off the highway long ago, but the position told a different story. The cab wasn't resting nose down or crushed as you'd expect from a fall. It had been carefully backed into the gully and covered, almost as if someone wanted it hidden, not lost. The vine plate, once cleaned of grime, told investigators everything they needed to know. The number matched a 2006 Peterbilt owned by Danner Freight Lines, the same rig Ray had been driving the night he disappeared in 2009. After nearly a decade of searching, the truck that had haunted his family's every hope had surfaced in the last place anyone imagined, 40 miles west of where it was last seen. The discovery reignited the investigation instantly. Forensic teams from both Arkansas and Texas converged on the scene, joined by FBI analysts familiar with long-term missing cases. The cab's frame was twisted, its mirrors sheared off, glass shattered from pressure and time. But inside, the details were hauntingly preserved. On the passenger floorboard lay a pair of decayed work gloves, stiff and discolored by age. A faded water bottle, its label barely legible, still carried a printed expiration date from early 2009, and on the inner edge of the driver's door frame, beneath a film of dust and rust, investigators found a faint trace of what appeared to be blood. It had dried, darkened, and blended into the metal over years of decay, but a luminol test lit it up in a sharp blue patterns. There was no trailer attached to the cab. Whatever Ray had been hauling the night he vanished was long gone. Tire impressions around the site were useless. Time and weather had erased everything. Yet what stood out most was how deliberate the concealment appeared. The ravine wasn't visible from any nearby road, and the truck had clearly been maneuvered there by someone familiar with heavy equipment. A tow or another semi could have placed it there, but the effort to bury it, using layers of brush, soil, and natural cover, meant whoever did it wanted to make sure it was never found. Within 48 hours, cadaver dogs were brought to the site. They were seasoned animals, trained for deep burial detection. The handlers started near the cab and worked their way outward. It didn't take long. One of the dogs signaled near a patch of disturbed earth about 40 yards uphill from where the Peterbilt sat. The soil was compact, but oddly uniform, as if it had been tamped down years ago. When investigators began to dig, the first thing they uncovered was a fragment of fabric, dark, fibrous, consistent with old work clothing. Then came the unmistakable curve of bone. Beneath roughly 2 feet of packed dirt, the recovery team uncovered a partial human skeleton, a femur, several ribs, and part of a skull. The remains were fragmented but largely undisturbed, preserved by the clay-rich soil. Alongside the bones lay small personal items, a corroded belt buckle, a watch face with the glass missing, and what looked like the remains of a wallet reduced to pulp and metal. For days, the area was treated as a full-scale homicide site. The skeletal remains were transported to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab for DNA comparison. Meanwhile, forensic anthropologists examined the burial method. The grave had been shallow, hastily done, but with clear intent. Someone had dug just deep enough to conceal the body, then used the ravine to hide the truck separately. The separation between the two suggested calculation, a need to distance the victim from the vehicle that could identify him. Back at the lab, the blood from the driver's door was analyzed first. It yielded degraded but viable DNA, which quickly matched the family reference samples on file from Carla and her son. Weeks later, the bones confirmed the same result. After 9 years of speculation, rumor, and silence, the remains found outside DeKalb, Texas, were officially identified as Earl Ray Danner. The news hit Carla like a wave she'd seen coming for years, but never braced for. She said later that it didn't feel like closure, more like confirmation of what her heart had known since that first sleepless night. The call she'd received years earlier, the strange ping near Texarkana, the reactivated GPS signal, suddenly all of it pointed in one direction. Ray hadn't simply vanished. He'd been silenced. Investigators now had a body, a vehicle, and a crime scene, but little else. The condition of the bones gave few immediate clues about cause of death. There were no visible bullet holes or fractures consistent with blunt trauma. Toxicology was impossible after so many years. But there was one telling sign: a thin fracture along the side of the skull near the temporal ridge, subtle but unnatural, possibly from a heavy impact or blunt force. It wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough to rule out a simple accident. The discovery transformed the case overnight from a missing persons file to an active homicide investigation spanning 2 states. Detectives who had long since moved on were pulled back in. Archived evidence was reopened. The impound lot where Ray's personal effects had been stored was searched again. What once seemed like random clues, his truck locked from the outside, the short-lived GPS reactivation, the phone call traced to Texarkana, now formed a pattern that looked deliberate. Media outlets picked up the story again, framing it as a ghost truck mystery solved. Reporters gathered near the site, broadcasting images of the mud-stained Peterbilt as crews winched it from the ravine. For viewers across the country, it looked like the end of a long, haunting case. But for investigators, it was just the beginning. The recovered GPS module from the truck's engine control unit revealed something extraordinary. When cleaned and connected to a diagnostic reader, it showed that the truck's ignition had been cycled on at least twice after the time of Ray's disappearance. The most recent activation matched that brief signal detected 3 days after the night he went missing. Exactly the anomaly that cold case analyst Megan Lowe had flagged 2 years earlier. It meant someone had moved the truck after the disappearance, likely the same person who'd buried it. In the days following the discovery, detectives began retracing Ray's final business contacts. His last deliveries, former colleagues, anyone with access to Danner Freight's routes. What emerged was a web of disputes and quiet tensions within the small trucking world he'd worked in. Late payments, disputed contracts, and a falling out with a former employer he'd once accused of falsifying records. But before any of that could be proven, investigators had to confirm the simplest truth: that Ray hadn't just died on the road, but that someone had taken steps to ensure his truck and body would never be found. The silence of that ravine, the precision with which the vehicle had been hidden, spoke of intent. It was the kind of burial that only made sense if someone had something to lose. And as investigators began following the trail of those old disputes, one name kept resurfacing. The man Ray had been supposed to meet the night he disappeared, a figure connected to a small freight company in Little Rock, known for operating under the radar. It was there, in those files, that the real story behind his disappearance would begin to surface. A story of betrayal, cover-ups, and the kind of quiet violence that hides in plain sight. By late 2018, the quiet discovery in that Texas ravine had transformed from a grim recovery into the beginning of a criminal reckoning. Forensic analysts began reassembling every detail of what was once thought to be an unsolvable mystery. The truck's location, the burial depth, the age of the soil, all of it began telling a story that pointed not to coincidence, but to calculation. Tire tracks preserved in hardened clay near the edge of the ravine became one of the first real clues. The impressions didn't match the treads on Ray's Peterbilt. They belonged to a different semi entirely. When compared to archive prints from local haulers, they produced a partial match, one tied to a small freight company out of Little Rock, Arkansas, called Ferguson Hauling LLC. The name meant nothing to the new investigators at first, but to those who'd known Ray, it hit like a jolt. Ferguson Hauling was the company he had left a year before his disappearance, abruptly, and not on good terms. He'd accused the owner, Frank Ferguson, of withholding pay and cooking shipping manifests, and those accusations had nearly escalated to a legal complaint before Ray walked away. The more detectives dug into the company's history, the stranger it became. Ferguson Hauling had quietly folded in 2011, barely 2 years after Ray vanished. Its records were spotty, tax filings incomplete, and half of its shipping manifests had been destroyed in a warehouse fire that investigators later discovered was never reported to insurance. Then came the break that changed everything. A man named Dale Porter, a former mechanic for Ferguson, came forward after seeing a local news story about the recovered truck. He told police he'd heard something years earlier, something that didn't sit right with him. One night at a bar in Little Rock back in 2010, Frank Ferguson had been drinking heavily when he muttered to a colleague that he'd had to shut someone up who talked too much about freight fraud. Porter thought it was just bravado at the time, a drunk man's empty threat. But when he saw the blue Peterbilt on TV, half buried in the dirt, he realized that someone might have been Ray Danner. Detectives brought Ferguson in for questioning in early November. He denied knowing anything about the disappearance, claiming Ray had quit without notice, and that they hadn't spoken since. But when investigators confronted him with evidence of falsified bills of lading and duplicate shipment logs from the months leading up to 2009, his answers grew evasive. It turned out Ferguson's operation had been running a quiet scam for years, moving legitimate cargo for one client, then secretly reusing paperwork to double-charge smaller shippers along the same route. The fraud relied on precise timing, untraceable transfers, and a small circle of trusted drivers. Ray had been one of them, and according to his wife, he'd started noticing inconsistencies in his manifests a few months before he quit. He'd mentioned to her that something didn't add up, that his logbooks and pay didn't match what the company was billing. He'd even kept copies of several load tickets at home, tickets that were missing from Ferguson's archived records. Investigators now believed that Ray had planned to confront Ferguson, not just to settle old disputes, but to warn that he was considering reporting the violations to federal auditors. The pieces began falling into place. Through subpoenaed phone records, they found messages between Ray and a driver still employed by Ferguson, someone named Curtis Hale. The messages were brief, mostly logistical, but one stood out. Sent on the evening of January 13, 2009, just hours before Ray vanished, it read, "Meet at 2:14. Frank wants to talk, just to clear things up." Hale's phone was disconnected within weeks of Ray's disappearance, and he'd since vanished from the workforce entirely. It was enough to establish a chilling new theory. Ray hadn't stopped at the rest area that night to sleep. He'd stopped there for a meeting. Investigators believed he was ambushed. Perhaps the argument turned violent, or maybe the decision had been made before he ever arrived. Either way, the signs pointed to a confrontation gone wrong, followed by a cover-up that spanned 2 states. To prove it, they retraced the likely sequence of events. Based on the truck's final transponder signal at 12:41 a.m., investigators estimated that Ray had arrived at exit 214 roughly 20 minutes before the last CB transmission. That window, between 12:25 and 12:45 a.m., was when the meeting likely took place. The rest area, poorly lit and isolated, would have provided privacy. Ray, expecting only a conversation, might have left the cab unlocked. If Ferguson or one of his drivers followed him there, it would have taken less than 5 minutes to overpower him. Forensic teams reconstructed the probable route used to move the truck afterward. The ignition data showed it was restarted about 30 minutes after the CB signal went dead. That meant someone else drove it away from the rest area, heading west instead of east. They crossed the Arkansas-Texas line before sunrise and buried the cab near DeKalb, likely with the help of a second vehicle, possibly the same Ferguson hauling rig whose tire tracks had been found nearby. Each new discovery darkened the story. Witness statements placed a Ferguson truck within that corridor multiple times that week, and toll logs confirmed its presence near Texarkana early on the morning of January 14, 2009, the same location where Carla's mysterious phone call had been traced 2 weeks later. The odds of that being coincidence were nearly impossible. As investigators connected the dots, a picture of the motive came into focus. Ray had been a liability. His complaints threatened to expose a web of fraudulent transactions totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. For Ferguson, who was already facing financial strain, exposure meant ruin, and for the men working under him, silence was survival. The FBI's forensic accountants eventually confirmed that Ferguson Hauling had rerouted shipments through ghost routes using falsified delivery reports that would have required Ray's truck to appear at locations he'd never actually been. When Ray left the company, he took some of those copies home, proof that could have ended the entire scheme. If he'd been planning to turn them in, it was reason enough for someone to want him gone. By early 2019, the evidence was overwhelming, though circumstantial. Prosecutors needed a witness. That's when they found one. A former dispatcher who'd left Ferguson hauling in 2010 contacted investigators, claiming she'd overheard a heated phone call between Ray and Ferguson the night before the disappearance. She remembered the owner saying, "You're making a mistake, Ray. Don't go running your mouth." That same dispatcher also confirmed seeing Hale, Ferguson's trusted driver, leave the yard late that night in one of the company's rigs, despite having no scheduled load. The pattern was undeniable. Ray had gone to that rest area believing he was there to talk. Instead, he'd walked straight into a trap. When detectives presented the full reconstruction to the district attorney, it read like something out of a crime novel: a whistleblower silenced, a fraudulent freight empire protected by fear, and a burial so careful it nearly succeeded. But what haunted them most was how easily the plan might have worked if not for chance. A construction crew digging in the right place nearly a decade later, uncovering the rusted shell of a truck that refused to stay buried. The case was now poised for its final act. Arrest warrants were being prepared, witnesses secured, and forensic confirmations rolling in. Yet even with all the evidence aligning, there remained one missing piece: the confession that would tie it all together, that would take the story from theory to truth. And that would come, unexpectedly, from a man who had once driven those same highways, carrying the same secret, waiting for the weight of it to finally break him. By the fall of 2018, nearly a decade after Earl Ray Danner vanished from a rest stop in western Arkansas, investigators had most of the puzzle: the truck, the bones, the motive, but not the truth, not in words. The case had weight, but no voice. The story of what really happened to Ray that night still lived in silence, carried by people who had long learned how to bury guilt deeper than evidence. That silence finally broke from an unlikely place: a hospice room just outside Little Rock. Harold "Skip" Collins had once been a driver for Ferguson Hauling LLC, the same company at the center of the growing investigation. He was 61 now, gaunt from lung cancer, and according to the nurse who later spoke with police, he'd begun having trouble sleeping. He told her that some nights he heard the sound of an idling engine, one that wasn't really there. The nurse mentioned it to his pastor, who in turn contacted state police. They sent a detective to see him, not expecting much. But Skip wasn't looking for leniency. He didn't have time left for that. He just wanted to unburden himself before the end. The conversation that followed was recorded with his consent. His voice was thin, cracking, but steady enough to carry what investigators had waited 9 years to hear. He started by saying that the night Ray Danner disappeared, he hadn't meant to be there. Ferguson had called him at the last minute, told him to bring one of the rigs and meet him at the I-40 rest area near exit 214. Skip said he thought it was about a freight pickup or a last-minute load adjustment, something that happened often, but when he arrived, the place was dark except for the glow of 2 semis parked side by side. One of them was Ray's blue Peterbilt. Ferguson was already there, along with another driver named Curtis Hale. According to Skip, Ray had been waiting outside the cab, standing by the front bumper with his hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't look afraid, just tense, like someone walking into an argument he'd already rehearsed a dozen times in his head. Ferguson told Skip to stay back, said it was a private talk, but voices rose fast. Ray accused him of stealing, of doctoring manifests, of cheating drivers out of pay. Skip said Ferguson tried to calm him down, saying it was just paperwork confusion. Then came a sound. Not a shout, not a scuffle, just a sharp thud against metal. When Skip turned, Ray was on the ground beside his own truck. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ferguson's expression changed from anger to shock. He said, "He slipped," but his voice shook. Then came panic. Hale knelt beside Ray, felt for a pulse, and shook his head. There was blood pooling near the bumper. Ferguson crouched down, muttered something about not letting this ruin everything, then turned to Skip and told him to help. Skip said he froze, didn't move, didn't breathe. He'd seen fights before, but never something that couldn't be undone. What happened next sounded almost procedural. They wrapped Ray's body in a tarp from Hale's truck, loaded it into the back of Ferguson's rig, and wiped down the Peterbilt's handles and cab. Ferguson ordered Skip to drive Ray's truck, following them west toward the state line. Skip said the drive felt endless, the kind of stretch of highway where nothing feels real, where you half expect to wake up back in your bunk. They stopped near a logging path outside DeKalb, Texas. There, under Ferguson's direction, they buried Ray's body in shallow ground and rolled the Peterbilt down a nearby ravine. The plan was to return in a few weeks, scrap the vehicle, and finish covering the site. But the weeks turned into years. Ferguson shut down the company not long after, and no one ever spoke of it again. Skip said Ferguson made it clear, if anyone talked, they'd share the blame. They were accomplices now, tied together by a single night they could never take back, and for nearly 10 years, that's how it stayed. Hale disappeared not long after, possibly under pressure from Ferguson himself. Skip kept driving under other companies, drinking heavier, sleeping lighter, until the cancer diagnosis stripped away everything but memory. He said he'd been waiting for someone to ask, waiting for the day when Ray's name would find its way back to him. When the tape ended, the detective sat in silence for several minutes before stepping out of the room. The confession was messy, unpolished, and devastatingly believable. It filled every blank space the evidence had left open. The blood on the doorframe, the tire tracks, the GPS ping, all of it aligned with Skip's account. Within a week, prosecutors obtained a warrant for Frank Ferguson's arrest. He was taken into custody at his home in Conway on a cold December morning. Neighbors said he didn't resist, didn't ask why. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. During interrogation, he denied everything at first, calling Skip's confession a dying man's delusion. But when confronted with the forensic results, the recovered tire impressions, the witness statements, the discrepancies in his old company's tax filings, his silence became its own admission. He eventually muttered that Ray should have just let things go. The trial moved quickly. The evidence, while circumstantial, was overwhelming when paired with Skip's recorded statement and supporting forensic data. In March 2019, Frank Ferguson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He died there 2 years later of a stroke, never once offering further detail about what happened that night. For Ray's family, the verdict was not celebration. It was exhaustion. Carla attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the same seat behind the prosecution table. When the sentence was read, she didn't cry. She just closed her eyes. Outside the courthouse, she told reporters, "It's never over, not really, but now we know, and knowing is something." A few weeks later, she and her son Tyler brought Ray's ashes back to Arkansas. They stopped at the same rest area where his truck had been found years earlier. The new pavement glistened from rain, the vending machines humming under fluorescent lights. Everything looked cleaner, safer, like the state had scrubbed away the memory of what once happened there. Tyler walked to the far end of the lot, where an old fence met the tree line, and scattered the ashes into the grass. Carla placed a hand on the utility pole they'd once taped notes to, and whispered the same words she'd repeated for nearly a decade. Rest stops aren't always safe. That phrase, once a warning, had become something else, a memorial for every driver who vanished without answers, every family left behind in the quiet spaces between mile markers. By December 2018, the case of Earl Ray Danner was officially closed. The file that had sat open for nearly 10 years was marked resolved, but its story didn't fade. It lived on in the faces of those who remembered him, in the pages of investigative training materials, in the minds of officers who now treated every missing trucker report with the seriousness it deserved. In the end, Ray's disappearance became more than just one man's tragedy. It was a reminder of how fragile ordinary moments can be, how a single late-night meeting at a rest stop can unravel an entire life, and how sometimes justice only arrives when the people who remember refuse to stop asking for it. And for the Danner family, that refusal became their legacy. A decade of grief, persistence, and unshakable faith had turned silence into truth. And somewhere along that long stretch of I-40, under the endless drone of passing freight, the story of the truck driver who vanished after a midnight stop finally found its rest.